the moment when presumption fell. The dojo was silent except for the rhythmic sound of Bruce Lee's feet gliding across the mat. He moved like water, fluid, unpredictable, each gesture a natural extension of the last. Ahead of him, Joe Hyams, a respected martial arts writer, watched with watchful eyes, trying to decipher the pattern. Hyams had already interviewed masters, analyzed techniques, written about the philosophy behind the moves. I believed I understood the game. Now he's going to throw a side kick, Hyams thought, crossing his arms. It is the movement that is repeated the most. Bruce stopped for a moment, his body slightly inclined, his eyes fixed on an imaginary point. Then, without warning, he spun in a circular motion, his fist slicing through the air toward what would be an opponent's face. Hyams blinked in surprise. It wasn't the kick I expected. Okay, he muttered to himself. He is testing variations. Next time, go back to the default. Bruce smiled, almost imperceptibly. There was something feline about his expression, as if he knew exactly what the writer was thinking. This time, he advanced with a quick step, but instead of attacking, he suddenly retreated, deliberately unbalancing himself before recovering with an agile leap. Hyams frowned. It wasn't a technique I recognized. He's playing with me, he realized, a little irritated. Bruce stopped again, this time turning to Hyams with a calm expression. You're trying to predict my movements, he said, his voice calm, but filled with a certainty that left no room for doubt. But art is not a puzzle to be solved. It's a river. You can study your current, but you'll never know exactly where the next wave will break. Hyams felt the weight of the words. He had spent years analyzing fighters, categorizing styles, reducing combat to formulas. But there, in front of Bruce, he realized that true mastery was not in anticipating, but in being the movement. Not in predicting, but in flowing. Bruce held out his hand, inviting him closer. Let's try something, he said. Close your eyes. Hyams hesitated, but complied. The air around him seemed to change as Bruce moved, no longer with the calculated precision he had before, but with a spontaneity that defied all logic. A light tap on the shoulder, a quick deflection, a barely perceptible sound of feet dragging on the floor. Hyams tried to react, but each attempt at anticipation only left him more lost. When he opened his eyes, Bruce was a few steps away, smiling. You can't predict what you don't know, he said. And the unknown is where true art lives. Hyams took a deep breath, feeling something break inside him, not confidence, but the illusion of control. There, in that dojo, he learned more than techniques. He learned that mastery was not about mastering others, but about mastering himself. And that, sometimes, the greatest lesson came not from getting it right, but from getting it wrong. Hyams remained motionless for a long moment, sweat running down his temple, his muscles still tense from the adrenaline of the fight. The dojo, once a space of order and discipline, now seemed to vibrate with a new energy, something he couldn't name, but felt resonating in his bones. Bruce, in turn, crossed his arms, watching him with an expression that mixed pride and defiance. You're thinking too much, Bruce said, breaking the silence. The body remembers before the mind. Hyams closed his eyes again, but this time not to calculate. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs and, little by little, the stiffness in his shoulders dissolved. When he opened them, something had changed. It was not a sudden transformation, but an acceptance, as if a previously locked inner door had opened. Try again, Bruce invited, assuming a neutral stance. This time, Hyams didn't hesitate. He moved not with the cold precision of before, but with a fluidity that surprised even himself. His feet slid across the mat, his arms responded without conscious planning, and when Bruce counterattacked, he didn't block, he redirected. The blow passed him like a breeze, and Hyams spun, using the momentum to knock his master off balance with a simple, almost unassuming movement. Bruce staggered, but recovered with a smile. Now yes. The training continued, but it was no longer a clash of techniques, but a dance. Every mistake Hyams made was no longer a failure but a step forward. Every hit Bruce made was not a defeat, but a lesson. Over time, the line between master and student blurred, and what remained was only movement, pure, instinctive, alive. When the session ended, they were both exhausted, but in a different way. Hyams sat on the floor, his back against the wall, while Bruce offered him a bottle of water. He accepted, drinking in long sips, feeling the coolness go down his throat. "What comes next?" Hyams asked, without looking at Bruce. "What always comes," replied the master, sitting next to him. "You continue." Not because he needs to prove something, but because he now knows there is no end. Mastery is not a destination, it is a path. And you've just taken the first real step. Hyams smiled, tired but light. There was no longer the need to control every detail, to anticipate every movement. There was only now, and that was enough. In the months that followed, Hyams returned to the dojo not as a student eager to master, but as someone who had found something greater than technique. He taught, trained, made mistakes and got things right, but always with the same clarity. The real fight was not against the opponent, but against one's own limitations. And one day, when a new student arrived at the dojo with the same rigidity, the same need for control that he once had, Hyams just smiled and assumed his stance. "Let's get started," he said, extending his hand. "But don't expect me to teach you how to win. I will teach you how to feel." Hyams observed the new student, a young man named Kale, whose tense shoulders and narrowed eyes betrayed the same armor he had once worn. Kale moved as if each gesture was an equation to be solved, as if the mat were a chessboard and not a space of flow. Hyams didn't immediately correct him. He let the boy repeat the katas with mechanical precision, his fists clenched, his breathing short. "You're fighting air," Hyams said finally, when Kale finished a series of blows. "There is no one here to defeat." Kale frowned, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "But the goal is to win, right?" Hyams shook his head slowly. "The goal is to be present. The rest is a consequence." Kale didn't understand. Or I didn't want to understand. In the following training sessions, he insisted on applying brute force, on anticipating each movement as if the fight were a test of memory and not instinct. Hyams watched him in silence, letting the young man come up against his own limits. Until, on an oppressively hot afternoon, Kale lost control during sparring. A poorly calculated blow hit Hyams in the shoulder, not with violence, but with the stiffness of someone who didn't know how to give in. Hyams didn't back down. He just stopped, took a deep breath and looked at Kale with an expression that the young man couldn't decipher. "You're scared," Hyams said simply. Kale huffed, crossing his arms. "Afraid of what? Of losing? Fear of not being perfect. Fear that if I don't control everything, something will slip out. But the fight is not about control. It's about trust." Kale laughed bitterly. "Trust? In what? By chance?" Hyams extended his hand, inviting him to start over. "On you. At the moment. In the fact that if you stop fighting yourself, the rest will fall into place." Kale hesitated. But for the first time, something in his chest loosened. It was not a surrender, but a glimpse, perhaps there was another way. In the months that followed, Kale still stumbled. It still fell. He still got frustrated when things didn't go as planned. But, little by little, he learned to listen to his own body, to feel his opponent's rhythm, to breathe between blows. Hyams didn't rush him. It was just there, a silent mirror, showing that true mastery was not in victory, but in the ability to lose yourself and find yourself over and over again. A year later, Kale faced an experienced opponent in a local tournament. He wasn't an exceptional fighter, but someone who understood the game, fast, precise, merciless. Kale felt the old instinct of control return, the desire to anticipate every move, to devise an infallible strategy. But then he remembered Hyams' words. Breathed. And, for the first time, he let himself go. He didn't win. But he didn't lose either. He fought. And when the gong sounded, he looked at Hyams in the audience and saw him nod, as if to say, "Now you understand." Hyams never competed again. It didn't need to. His dojo grew, not in fame or number of trophies, but in something more subtle, the ability to transform students into apprentices, warriors into human beings. He grew old there, among the smell of sweat and wood, watching generations go through the same cycle of resistance and surrender. Until, one peaceful morning, as he was sweeping the mat, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. It wasn't a surprise. His body had always been a reluctant ally, but now, finally, it relented. He sat in the center of the dojo, legs crossed, hands on his knees. He closed his eyes. There were no regrets. There was no rush. Just the sound of your own breathing, slow, deep, like a last kata. When the students arrived, they found him there, calm, as if he had decided that this was the right time to leave. Kale, now an instructor, knelt beside her and held her hand. There were no words. Just the weight of a lesson that no longer needed to be said. The dojo continued. The doors remained open. And, in each student who crossed the threshold, Hyams lived a little more, not as a master, but as a reminder, the struggle was never about winning. It was always about feeling.